Over the last 200 years, humans have used cameras to record our interactions with wildlife. Photos give us a unique look back at how our world has changed, and at some of the shameful ways that we have treated animals. In this video, we're taking a look at some of the most interesting historical photographs of animals. The first modern camera was developed in 1816, but most of the earliest photographs didn't survive. The earliest surviving photograph is this picture from 1826 or 1827 of a cityscape in France. In the 1840s, a French photographer named Joseph Philibert Giraud de Pranguet was producing plenty of firsts. He took the first known photographs of Greece, Egypt, Turkey, and the Middle East. But recently, one of his photos surfaced that is a first of a different kind. This picture, titled Rome Forum Boeuf, was donated to a gallery in New York. It shows several cows and carts at the Roman Forum. Knowing that it was taken in Rome, historians looked into the photographer's travel history to discover when it was taken. They found that he was only known to have visited Rome between April and July of 1842, meaning that the photograph almost certainly dates from that period of 4 months. It's believed to be the earliest surviving photograph of an animal in the world. Other early photographs include this picture of a goat from the 1850s, also taken in Rome, as well as this picture of a horse-drawn American Express wagon from the 1850s, taken in the United States. The American bison once flourished on the plains and prairies of North America. As many as 60 million animals are estimated to have once roamed free. Many indigenous groups in North America relied on the bison to survive. They consumed their meat, used their skins for making clothing, and used their bones to produce tools and weapons. But with the arrival of European settlers beginning at the end of the 15th century, the bison began to be hunted with guns. Vast numbers of animals were slaughtered to feed the growing population. By the late 18th century, the wholesale slaughter of the bison wasn't just for food. The colonies along the east of the continent wanted to expand west, but clashes with indigenous people made it more and more difficult. So Americans of European descent began to kill off the bison in order to limit the access indigenous people had to one of their most important resources. Bison numbers declined rapidly. In 1892, this picture was taken at the Michigan Carbon Works in Rougeville. Bones of the bison that had been slaughtered in the West were shipped by train to be turned into fertilizer. The photo is widely published today as an example of the careless human attitudes towards the natural world and the widespread destruction caused by us for selfish temporal gain. There are thousands of bison skulls in the photograph. Interestingly, at the time that this photo was taken, fewer than 600 wild bison remained in only a few isolated populations. Conservation efforts over the last century have brought their numbers back up to just over 30,000. But North America no longer has space for the vast herds that once flourished there. Perhaps the most iconic species of African animal is the elephant. There are 2 species of elephant in Africa, and in the 18th century, as many as 26 million of them lived in the wilds of the continent. By the beginning of the 20th century, Africa was down to only 10 million. Their decline is linked to several factors. One of the reasons for their decline has been a growing human population, which has led to a major loss of habitat for large animals like elephants. But the primary reason for their decline has been the ivory trade. Ivory was used to produce piano keys, figurines, and cutlery handles. It became more and more popular around the world, and with a growing demand, hunting pressures on elephants got worse and worse. In 1980, this picture was taken in Kenya. The population of elephants in the country stood at around 60,000, and they still roamed the savanna in massive herds. While this number may seem impressive, only 10 years prior, there were 3 times as many elephants in Kenya, with 2/3 having been hunted for their ivory over the course of only a decade. By 1989, fewer than 20,000 elephants survived in the country, and around this time, the international trade on ivory was banned. But in a few countries in the eastern part of Asia, demand remained high. Traditional art and medicine play an important part in Chinese culture, and as a result, high sums are paid for ivory from poached elephants. Today, just over 415,000 bush elephants remain in the whole of Africa, with Kenya being home to about 36,000 of them. For tens of thousands of years, dogs have been used for hunting, protection, and companionship by people. As humans spread around the world, we took our dogs with us, with hundreds of breeds being produced. The majority of dog breeds in existence today originated in Europe and Asia, but the Americas were once home to a variety of breeds that had been bred over millennia to help in the lives of indigenous people. The Salish peoples inhabit the coastal regions of what is now Washington State in the US and British Columbia, Canada. Over thousands of years, they developed amazing and unique forms of art. One of their primary art forms was weaving. While plant fibers, mountain goat wool, and down feathers were occasionally used, the Salish people had a far more interesting source for the majority of their wool. They had a breed of dog, known as the Salish wool dog. Remains of this breed have been found dating as far back as 5,000 years. The Salish people had another breed of dog that was descended from coyotes, which they kept in their villages. But in order to keep the wool dogs pure and maintain their long white fur, the Salish wool dogs were kept separate. They would be placed on small offshore islands or trapped in caves in groups of 12 to 20 animals. Every year in May or June, they would be sheared, and their wool would be woven into blankets. These blankets took a long time to produce, and were symbols of status and wealth. The dogs were not easy to maintain. Being carnivorous, they needed to be fed large quantities of fish and meat in order to keep them alive. So when Europeans introduced sheep, the breeding of the Salish wool dog was abandoned. While several drawings and artworks exist of purebred Salish wool dogs, very few photos do. In fact, all of the photos that I was able to find are believed to show dogs that were mixed with other European or American breeds. They were no longer being kept separate and had moved from existing for wool to being family pets. Today, this breed is considered to be extinct. When World War I began in 1914, Canadians were called to serve alongside the British. Lieutenant Gary Colborne volunteered to serve and boarded a train for the East Coast. At a stop along the way in Ontario, he purchased an American black bear cub for $20 Canadian, which today would be equivalent to just over $500. The cub's mother had been killed, and she was very young enough that Colborne had a feeling she would adapt well to being around humans. Being from the city of Winnipeg himself, Colborne decided to name her Winnipeg, which was eventually shortened to Winnie. Winnie became a mascot for the troops for the nearly 3 months she spent traveling with them. She crossed the Atlantic with the men and spent over a month with the troops in England before it was time for them to depart for France. Winnie wasn't allowed to continue with the troops, so Colborne left her at the London Zoo with the plan of taking her back to Winnipeg when he returned. But Winnie was loved by the zoo staff and by the London public, so she remained there until her death. One day in the 1920s, English author A. Milne was visiting the London Zoo with his son, Christopher Robin. Christopher carried with him his stuffed bear named Edward, which his father had purchased from Harrods department store. When they came to the enclosure with Winnie, they both were enamored with her. So much so that Christopher Robin renamed his teddy Winnie after her. Of course, Milne would go on to write the world-famous stories of Winnie the Pooh and his adventures in the 100-Acre Wood with Christopher Robin. This was the real Winnie. The Bali tiger was only found on the Indonesian island of Bali. They're considered to have been a population of the Sunda subspecies, but they had genetic and morphological differences from other populations. One of the obvious differences was their smaller size. In fact, they were physically the smallest population of Sunda tigers in the world. Their skulls were smaller in size to that of the Javan tiger and with more marked cheekbones, and their hair was short and bright orange, with fewer black stripes than other populations. Very few specimens of Bali tigers exist in museums today, and even fewer pictures of living animals are known to exist. Most of the photos are of animals that had sadly been hunted. The only confirmed photos of living Bali tigers are from the Ringling Brothers Circus in the United States. The circus was known to have 3 tigers which had been taken from Bali, and only 2 photos of these tigers remain. One shows a tiger jumping on a trainer, while a second Bali tiger walks by. It's estimated to have been taken around 1915. The other shows a Bali tiger standing on its hind paws, being held up by tiger trainer Rose Flanders Bascom in 1914. Only 1 year after this photo was taken, she was clawed by one of the lions that she was training, got an infection, and passed away. Tigers were likely always rare on Bali, but as the island was converted for palm and rice plantations, and with the arrival of Dutch sport hunters from Java, the tigers declined quickly. The last confirmed sighting of a Bali tiger was in 1937 in West Bali National Park. While they probably survived into the 1940s or 50s, by the 1960s, they were almost certainly gone. During the Ottoman era, faith was summarized as respecting the words of Allah and His creatures, which included caring for animals. This led people to prioritize feeding and caring for the animals within the empire. The Ottomans also punished those who mistreated animals, and communities ostracized individuals who harmed them. They established various foundations to care for animals, including feeding street dogs and cats and treating injured animals. They built birdhouses and placed water pans on gravestones for birds, and records show that people regularly made large donations for animal care. The Istanbul National Library, once called the Cat Library, was known for its manager's care for street cats, and many local residents volunteered their time and energy in order to help out. The city was also famous for caring for street dogs. But this caused a problem. As people threw scraps to the dogs in the streets, the dogs inevitably became more and more aggressive, trying to defend their territories where the best scraps were being offered. So the decision was made to put an end to the excess of street dogs. In 1910, 40,000 dogs were rounded up and dropped off on a rocky island in the Sea of Marmara. As they cried and barked, the people in the city were said to be tormented by their calls. People began to row out and throw food on the island to try to help the dogs, but it wasn't enough. They all perished, and the smell of decomposition angered the residents of the city, who felt that what had happened to the dogs was a sin. As the empire became entangled in wars and eventually fell in the coming years, many Turks felt that this was a punishment for the treatment of Istanbul's street dogs. Beginning in the 1940s, different countries began a race to put the first person in space, with the Soviet Union winning in 1961. While this was the first human in space, there had been plenty of firsts before that. Animals were also being used for spaceflight. In most cases, to test the effects of space on living organisms without risking human life. In 1947, a group of fruit flies made it to over 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, making them the first animals to successfully be sent into space. An attempt was made with a rhesus macaque named Albert I, but he only reached an altitude of at most 63 kilometers. So a second attempt was made in 1949 with another rhesus macaque named Albert II. This time, he successfully reached 134 kilometers, making him the first mammal and first primate in space. Unfortunately, on the way back down, the parachute failed to deploy, and Albert II was lost in the ensuing crash. The United States, China, and the Soviet Union sent mice on multiple occasions into space. In a video produced by the US government, 2 mice are shown in an experiment on the effects of thrust and zero gravity. On board the 7-foot-tall rocket that they were launched into space in were also 2 macaques, both sedated and strapped down. Thankfully, on this launch, all of the mice and the monkeys survived. One of the most tragic stories of an animal in space is the story of Laika, a Soviet dog that was the first ever animal to successfully make it into orbit. Her training was intense and cruel, and it was known from the start that she wouldn't be coming back. The truth of what actually happened to her was covered up by the Soviets and not fully revealed until 2002, 45 years after she made it into space. I plan to tell her story in detail in a video later this week. To this day, animals are sent in rockets for a variety of tests. Frogs, insects, squid, plants, and many other animals have all spent time in space. While we have learned a lot from them, the practice of testing spaceflight on animals is one that is hotly debated. When humans arrived in Australia, the impact was devastating. Much of the megafauna of the continent disappeared thanks to a combination of environmental changes, human hunting, and the introduction of foreign species. With European arrival to Tasmania, the losses continued. The Tasmanian emu was said to be numerous on the island, but within 40 years of the arrival of the English, they were gone. The next to go was the Tasmanian tiger, also known as the Thylacine. Thylacines were incredible marsupials that, thanks to convergent evolution, had evolved into something that looked very similar to a dog. They had sharp teeth, a long tail, and they stood on their toes just like dogs do. But they still had the characteristic pouch for carrying their young. Because of their similarity to European foxes, farmers hated them, fearing that they would attack and consume their livestock. As a result, the government of Tasmania issued a bounty for the animals, and widespread persecution ensued. By the 1920s, the thylacines were so rare that attitudes began to change, from hate to curiosity. The remaining wild thylacines were regularly collected for zoos around the world, further contributing to their decline. This photo shows farmer Wilf Batty. When he spotted a thylacine on his farm in 1930, he didn't hesitate to do what every farmer in the area was told to do. He grabbed his gun and shot it. This photo was taken after the fact, and amazingly, this ended up being the last thylacine known to be killed in the wild. While the species persisted in zoos and likely survived in the forests of Tasmania into the 1940s, no confirmed wild sighting has taken place since the last wild thylacine was captured alive for the Hobart Zoo in 1936. The species was declared extinct in 1986, but many believe that it's still out there. Today, it's one of the most popular cryptid species, and several people have dedicated their entire lives to searching for them. In 1849, a new tea shop was opened near Hyde Park in London. Known as Harrods, it quickly began to expand thanks to the popularity of tea. By 1881, they had purchased many of the surrounding businesses and had departments selling medicines, perfumes, stationery, fruit, and vegetables, employing over 100 people. When it burned to the ground in December 1883, it didn't go under. Instead, they focused on completing all of their Christmas deliveries and made record profits. By the time it was rebuilt, it had been catapulted to the height of popularity and fashion. Celebrities and nobility alike shopped in the many departments of Harrods, eager to get their hands on the highest quality goods from around the world. In 1917, Harrods opened a new department that was totally unique on the London shopping scene. Called Pet Kingdom, they didn't just sell dogs, cats, and birds. Harrods, after all, was now associated with the upper echelons of society. Here, the wealthiest patrons could get their hands on the most exotic of pets from around the world. These are photos of a young cassowary that was for sale. Here, we have a tapir from South America. The store even occasionally stocked animals as large as elephants. Large cats were also for sale, which were particularly popular among the rich. Perhaps the most famous cat purchased at Harrods was Christian the lion. He had been taken from the wild in Kenya in 1969 and was sold as a cub at Harrods to 2 Australian backpackers. He ended up living in the basement of a furniture shop in Chelsea for a time, before being moved to a large enclosure in Surrey. In 1971, when he had gotten too big, he was fortunate enough to be flown back to Africa and released back into the wild at Kora National Park in Kenya. A documentary was filmed in which the 2 Australian men who had purchased him were reunited with Christian in the wild, and on YouTube it has amassed nearly 17 million views. With the introduction of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, the sale of many exotic species became banned internationally. Harrods ended the selling of exotic animals, instead focusing on quality breeds of dog and cat. And in 2014, Pet Kingdom was closed entirely. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, help me out with a like and a comment. And if you want to come back for more videos like this, why not subscribe to the channel? I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to make a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, check out the link in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.